Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Village Affairs by Miss Reed. Chapter 6, The Managers' Meeting. Amy's last week at Fairacre School arrived all too soon, and I was desolate. She was such good company, as well as being an efficient teacher, that I knew I should miss her horribly. "Well, I'd stay if I could," she assured me, "but Vanessa arrives next week, and I hope she'll stay at least a fortnight. She's rather under the weather. There's a baby on the way. Or babies, perhaps. Good heavens, do they think it will be twins? The foolish girl has been taking some idiotic nonsense called fertility tablets, so it's quite likely she'll give birth to half a dozen." "But surely the doctors know what they're doing, be your age," said Amy inelegantly. She studied the lipstick with which she had been adorning her mouth. "I must have had this for years. It's called Tutankhamun tit." "It can't date from that time?" Amy sighed. "The Tutankhamun exhibition, dear, which dazzled us all some years ago. Everything was Egyptian that year, if you remember. James even bought me a gold necklace shaped like Cleopatra's asp. Devilish cold it is, too, coiled on one's nice warm bosom." "I'm glad about Vanessa's baby," I said. "I look forward to knitting a matinee jacket. I've got a pattern for backward beginners that always turns out well. Is she pleased?" "After 11 in the morning. Before that, poor darling, she is being sick. Tarquin is terribly thrilled and already planning a mammoth bonfire for the tenants on the local ben, or whatever the North British term they use for a mountain in Scotland." "He'll have to build 6 bonfires if your fears prove correct." "He'd be delighted to, I have no doubt. He's a great family man, and I must say he's very, very sweet to Vanessa. They seem extremely happy." She snapped shut her powder compact, stood back, and surveyed her trim figure reflected murkily in the light of the world. "I think I might present Fairacre School with a pier glass," she said thoughtfully. "It would never get used," I told her, "except when you came." We went to let in the noisy crowd from the playground. Mrs. Pringle's slimming efforts seemed to be having little result except to render her even more morose than usual. I did my best to spare her, exhorting the children to tidy up carefully at the end of afternoon school, and putting away my own things in the cupboards instead of leaving them on window sills and the piano top, as I often do. Luckily, in the summer term, the stoves do not need attention, but even so it was obvious that she was finding her work even more martyr-making than before. I was not surprised when she did not appear one morning, soon after Amy's departure, and a note arrived borne by Joseph Coggs. He pulled it from his trouser pocket in a fine state of stickiness. I accepted it gingerly. "How did it get like this, Joe?" "I got a toffee in my pocket." "What else?" "I got a gooseberry." "Anything else?" "I got a bit of licorice." "You'd better turn out that pocket." "I ain't got it, and if you say 'got her' one more time, Joseph Coggs, you'll lose your play." "Yes, miss, I was only going to say I ain't got a thing more." He retired to his desk after putting his belongings on the side table, and I read the missive. "Dear Miss Reed, have stomach upset and am obliged to stay home. Have had terrible night, but have taken nutmeg on milk, which should do the trick as it has afore. Clean clothes are in the drawer, and the head is off of the broom. Mrs. Pringle." I called to see my old sparring partner that evening. She certainly looked unusually pale and listless. "I'm rough, very rough," was her reply to my inquiries. "There's no hope of me coming back to that back-breaking job of mine this week." "Of course not. We'll manage," Mrs. Pringle snorted. "But what I mind more is not doing out that dining room of yours for the managers tomorrow." "I'll do it. It's not too bad." She gave me a dark look. I've seen your sort of housework, dust left on the skirting boards and on top of the doors. I don't suppose any of the managers will be running their fingers along them, I said mildly. Has the doctor been? I'm not calling him in. It's him as started this business. How do you mean? It's this here diet, drinking lemon juice first thing in the morning. That's what made my stomach flare up. Then leave it off, I cried. Dr. Martin wouldn't expect you to drink it if it upset you. Oh, wouldn't he? And the price of lemon's what it is, too. I bought a bottle of lemon juice instead, and that's just as bad. She waved a hand toward a half-empty bottle on the sideboard, and I went to inspect it. It certainly smelled odd. Is it fresh? Mrs. Pringle looked uneasy. I bought it half price in Caxley. The man said they'd had it some time. Chuck it away. It's off. The lady bridled. At 15 pence a bottle? Not likely. Use oranges instead, I urged. This is doing you no good, and anyway, oranges are easier to digest. She looked at me doubtfully. You wouldn't tell Dr. Martin? Of course I wouldn't. Let me empty this down the sink. Mrs. Pringle sighed. Anything you say. I ain't got the strength to argue. She watched me as I approached the sink and unscrewed the bottle. The smell was certainly powerful. The liquid fizzed as it ran down the waste pipe. One thing, I said, brightening. It'll clean out the drain, lovely. It was certainly a pity that Mrs. Pringle had not given the dining room the attention it deserved, but I thought it looked quite grand enough to accommodate the managers. There are 6 of them. The vicar is chairman and has been for many years, and the next in length of service is the local farmer, Mr. Roberts. When I was first appointed, I was interviewed by Colonel Wesley and Miss Parr, both then nearly 80 and now at rest in the neighboring churchyard. Their places were taken by Mrs. Lamb, the wife of the postmaster, and Peter Hale, a retired schoolmaster from Caxley, who is very highly regarded by the inhabitants of Fairacre and brings plenty of common sense and a practical experience of schooling to the job. The other 2 managers are Mrs. Maughan and Mrs. Moffat, the latter the sensible mother of Linda Moffat, the best-dressed child in the school. She is particularly valuable as she can put forward the point of view of parents generally and is not too shy to speak her mind. On Wednesday we had a full house, which is unusual. It is often Mr. Roberts who is unable to be present and who sends a message, or sometimes puts an apologetic face round the door, to say a ewe or a cow is giving birth or the harvest is at a crucial stage, and quite rightly we realize the necessity for putting first things first, and the meeting proceeds without him. As well as the 6 managers, Mr. Salisbury arrived complete with pad for taking notes. I had a seat by him with my usual brief report on such school matters as attendance, social activities, and the like. Also in evidence were the log book of the school and the punishment book, the latter with its pages virtually unsullied since my advent. The vicar made a polite little speech about the pleasure of using my house for the meeting. The minutes were ready and signed, and I gave my report. There were the usual requests to the office for more up-to-date lavatories and wash basins. The skylight, which has defied generations of Fairacre's handymen to render it rainproof, was mentioned once more, and Mr. Salisbury solemnly made notes on the pad. We fixed a date for our next term's meeting and then settled back for any other business. Is there any message in particular, asked Gerald Partridge, from the office? We have heard some disquieting rumors. Oh, said Mr. Salisbury, what about? Might close the school, said Mr. Roberts, who does not mince words. Really? Cried Mrs. Moffat. I hadn't heard a thing. Now that I get my groceries delivered, I hardly ever go to the shop, and it's amazing how little one hears. I've taken to going into Caxley for my provisions, said Mrs. Maughan conversationally. I can't say I enjoy these supermarkets, but when soap powder is 10 pence cheaper, it makes you think. And bleaching liquid, agreed Mrs. Moffat, and things like tomato ketchup. I make my own, broke in Mrs. Lamb. We grow more tomatoes than we can cope with, and it's no good trying to freeze them, and bottled tomatoes are not the same as fresh ones, are they? If you're interested, I have a very good recipe for ketchup I can let you have. The ladies accepted the offer enthusiastically. The vicar wore a resigned look. Most of our village meetings get out of hand like this, and he is quite used to waiting for these little asides to resolve themselves. Mr. Salisbury, tapping his expensive pen against his expensive false teeth, looked rather less patient and cast meaning glances at the chairman. Mrs. Moffat had just embarked on a long and somewhat confused account about pickling walnuts when the vicar rapped gently on the table and said kindly, "Order, please, dear ladies. I think Mr. Exeter has something to tell us." Mr. Salisbury, taking his new name in stride, put down the pad and assumed an expression of disarming candor. "Well, I don't quite know just what you have been hearing at Fairacre, and I can assure you that the office would always consult with the managers of any school as soon as the possibility of closure cropped up." "And has it?" asked Mr. Roberts. "There is always some chance of really small schools becoming uneconomic," began Mr. Salisbury cautiously. He's been through this hoop many times before. I thought to myself, how far would he commit himself today? "Fairacre's not really small," said Mrs. Maughan. "I like a small school anyway," pronounced Mrs. Moffat. "Much more friendly," agreed Mrs. Lamb. "There are certain disadvantages," said Mr. Salisbury. "Lack of team games, for instance. No specialist teachers on the staff for certain subjects. Older children get deprived." "Deprived?" squeaked Mrs. Lamb. "Our children aren't deprived, are they, Miss Reed?" "I hope not," I said. "But what about Fairacre?" persisted Mr. Roberts. "Are you sharpening the knife for us?" "Nothing will be done without your knowledge and cooperation," repeated Mr. Salisbury. "But it's on the cards?" asked Peter Hale quietly. "Is that it?" "Numbers are going down steadily," replied Mr. Salisbury. "We have to assess each case on its merit. Certainly Fairacre is costing us a lot of money to maintain, and the children might well be better off at a larger school." "Such as Beech Green?" "Such as Beech Green," agreed Mr. Salisbury. "When?" said Mr. Roberts. Mr. Salisbury put down his pen and tilted back in his chair. I hoped that the rear legs of my elderly dining-room chair would stand the strain. "It might be years. It all depends on numbers, on getting staff, a problem you are facing at the moment, and the feelings of managers and parents of the school." The vicar was looking unhappy. "But what about Miss Reed? It is unthinkable that she should have her school taken from her." There was a rumble of agreement around the table. Mr. Salisbury smiled at me. I felt like Red Riding Hood facing the wolf. "Miss Reed's welfare is our concern, of course. There would always be a post for her in the area, that I can promise you." "But we want her here," wailed Mrs. Lamb, "and we don't want our school to close." "Absolutely right," said Mrs. Maughan. "People in Fairacre simply won't stand for their children being uprooted and carted away in buses like so many animals," prompted Mr. Roberts helpfully. No, not animals," said Mrs. Maughan testily. "Animals don't go in buses. What I mean is we won't have it. We'll never let Fairacre School close." She looked round the table. Her face was red, her eyes bright. "Agreed?" "I do, for one," said Mr. Roberts. "I never heard such a shocking thing in my life. The idea of some of our little tots being hauled off to Beech Green Fair gives me the shudders. This school's served the village for over 100 years, and I don't see why it shouldn't go on doing for another 100. "Hear, hear," said Mrs. Lamb. Mr. Salisbury scribbled something on his pad, then looked up. "Well, Mr. Chairman, I have noted the objections of the managers, though I must point out that no decision of any kind has been taken by the committee about Fairacre School." "I hope nothing will happen to disturb the status quo," said the vicar. "We are all extremely happy with our little school. We should be deeply distressed if anything were done to close it, and we rely upon you to keep us informed of any developments." Mr. Salisbury nodded agreement and began to put his things together. The vicar glanced at the clock. "If that is all our business, then nothing remains for me to do but to thank Mr. Wells for coming here today and to remind you of the date of the next meeting." Mr. Salisbury smiled at us all, shook my hand warmly, and departed. "He'd better not try any funny business with our village school," said Mr. Roberts, watching the car drive away. "And don't you bother your head about all that nonsense, Miss Reed. We're all behind you in this." "Indeed we are," said the vicar. "They closed Springbourne, though," said Mrs. Moffat thoughtfully. "Took 'em 10 years," observed Mr. Roberts. "A lot can happen before they think of Fairacre again. In any case, we can all have a damn good fight over it, and I bet we'd win. The parents would be with us, that I do know." One by one the managers left, until only Mr. Partridge remained with me. "We don't seem to have gone very far with this business," he remarked, "but at least it has been mentioned, and I think that is a good thing. He seems a good fellow, this Mr. Winchester, I mean." "Salisbury," I interjected. "Salisbury, yes, Salisbury. I feel he would act honorably and not do anything without letting us know first." "So I should hope." "Don't upset yourself about it, dear Miss Reed. I cannot believe that it would ever happen here." "Let's hope not," I said. I really felt that I could not discuss the wretched business any more, and I think the vicar sensed this, for he patted my shoulder encouragingly and made his departure. I felt more shaken by the meeting than I would have admitted to anyone. My mouth was dry, my knees wobbly. I tottered into the garden and sat on the seat. Everything around me burst with healthy life. Sparrows flashed from plum tree to cherry tree. A peacock butterfly flapped its bejeweled wings from a daisy top. The pinks gave out their heady scent. The rosebuds opened gently in the warm air. Even Tibby displayed every sign of well-being, with his stomach exposed to the sun, his eyes blissfully closed. Only I, it seemed, was at odds with my surroundings. Their very beauty emphasized my own malaise. Should I ever come to terms with this horrible, nagging uncertainty? Would it be better to take the bull by the horns and apply for another post now? If I kept putting it off, I should be too old to be considered by other managers. Perhaps I was too old already? How old was Emily Davis, I wondered, when she first heard that Springbourne was going to close? How long did Mr. Roberts say that was hanging over her? 10 years? The suspense could not be borne. At least, I told myself, no one need know yet about the shadow coming nearer. Enough to let the rumors die down, as they were doing quite comfortably, before stirring them up again like a swarm of angry bees. I went indoors at length and tried to busy myself with bottling gooseberries, but the operation did not get my whole attention. I was glad when Mr. Willett knocked at the back door and asked if he could borrow my edging shears. It was a comfort to exchange a few general remarks with him on the state of our gardens and the surprising need for rain at this time of year. I accompanied him to the gate. "All right if I bring these here cutters back in the morning?" he asked. "Fine," I told him. "I shan't be doing any gardening tonight." "I'd have an early night if I was you," he advised me. "You look a bit peaky. I hears they brought up that school closing business again at your meeting. Bit of a shock, no doubt, but you put it out of your head." I was too stunned to reply. He smiled kindly upon me. "Us'll rout anyone who tries to shut up our school. You can bet your last farthing on that." He strode down the lane, my edging shears across his shoulder like a gun. "There goes a militant Christian," I said to Tibby. But how on earth did he know? Chapter 7. Troubles Never Come Singly. Now that Amy had gone to attend her other commitments, I was left to cope alone once again. Luckily, it would be only for 1 week, or so the office told me. After that, help was at hand in the form of Mrs. Rose, who had been headmistress of a small school nearby. That school had been closed for some 2 years, and Mrs. Rose was now euphoniously termed a peripatetic teacher. This meant that she moved from school to school, sometimes helping children who found reading difficult, and sometimes acting as a supply teacher when staff was short. I viewed her advent with mixed feelings. She was over 60 and was in this present job because she was in the last stages of her 40 years' service. Her health was not good, and she was a martyr to laryngitis. On the other hand, she was of a gentle disposition, anxious to fit in, open to suggestions, and generally amenable. And in any case, the mere presence of another human being, even one as frail as Mrs. Rose, on the other side of the glass partition was a great comfort and support. In the meantime, I soldiered on and was relieved in a way to have the school to myself in order to try to come to terms with the dreadful possibility of becoming, like Mrs. Rose, a teacher without a school of my own. Despite my airy dismissal of rumors on so many earlier occasions, this time I had an uncomfortable feeling that change was in the wind. Something in Mr. Salisbury's manner at the managers' meeting made me fear the worst, and I was surprised to find how upset I was. Normally, I sleep for 9 hours, drugged with work and good downland air. Now I took an hour or more before drifting off as I tossed and turned, trying to decide what to do. Even my appetite suffered, a most unusual symptom, and I found myself nibbling a biscuit and cheese rather than facing a square meal in the evening. What Amy would have said if she could have witnessed my more than usually casual eating habits, I shuddered to think. Now and again I found myself trembling, too. Good heavens, was I becoming senile into the bargain? Fat chance I should have of landing another teaching post if I appeared before strange managers with my head shaking and possibly a drop on the end of my nose. It was all extremely unnerving, and I was grateful for the children's company in my alarming condition. There were other disquieting factors. The weather had turned cold and blustery despite the fact that June had arrived. We could have done with some heating from the tortoise stoves, but that, of course, was out of the question. Then Minnie Pringle's presence about the house on Friday afternoons was distinctly unsettling. On the first visit, she had managed to drop a jar of bath salts into the hand basin, smashing the former and badly cracking the latter. Also, in a fit of zeal, she had attacked my frying pan with disinfectant powder, kept for the dustbin, and some steel wool, thus effectively removing the non-stick surface. I thought as it was vim, she explained in answer to my questioning. But it has disinfectant powder on the tin. Can't read them long words, said Minnie truculently. But you can read Vim, can't you? And this tin didn't have Vim written on it. Looked the same to me, replied Minnie, and flounced off, tripping over a rug on the way and bringing the fire irons into the hearth with a fearful crash. I fled into the garden, unable to face any more destruction. So must victims of earthquakes feel, I thought, as they await the next shattering blow. It was during this unsettled period that the case of Arthur Coggs and his companions was heard at Caxley. As they appeared in court on market day, several people from Fairacre were interested spectators, among them Mr. Willett. He had traveled in by bus to pick up some plants from the market, and having 2 hours to spare before the bus returned, decided to witness the fate of the 4 accused. Mr. Lovejoy, the most respected solicitor in Caxley, was defending all 4 as he had done on many previous occasions. And an uphill job he'll have this time, commented Mr. Willett to me. They had the sauce to plead not guilty, too. Perhaps it's true, I said. Mr. Willett snorted, puffing out his stained mustache. Want to bet on it? Anyway, old Colonel Austin was in the chair, and he read out a bit before they got started about committing 'em to Crown Court if they was found guilty. Something about their characters and antecedents, whatever that means. But it made it plain that they could get clobbered for more than 6 months if need be, and I'd stake my oath that that's where they'll end up. All 4's got a list as long as my arm, everyone knows. A man is innocent, I said primly, until he is proven guilty. Them 4, replied Mr. Willett, are as innocent as old Nick himself. My heart bleeds for that chap Lovejoy trying to whitewash them villains. It'd turn my stomach to do a job like that. I'd as sooner dig 100-acre field with a hand fork, that I would. Well, we will follow the trials of Fairacre, in one case a literal trial, next time.